Picture this. You're a noblewoman in Renaissance Florence, and you've just discovered something that could destroy your family's reputation, cost you your inheritance, and potentially end your life. You're pregnant, but not by your husband. Maybe it's your lover, maybe it's your brother-in-law, or maybe it's the result of something far darker that you've never spoken about to anyone. The growing life inside you isn't just a child. It's evidence of a scandal that could topple dynasties and ruin bloodlines that have ruled for centuries. Your corset grows tighter each day, but you can't let anyone notice. Your monthly courses have stopped, but you must maintain the fiction that nothing has changed. Most terrifying of all, you know that in a few months your body will betray your secret in ways that no amount of clever tailoring can hide. So you begin planning something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. A deception so elaborate and so dangerous that discovery would mean certain death. This is the story of how noble women in the Renaissance didn't just hide pregnancies. They orchestrated some of the most sophisticated and horrifying cover-ups in human history, using methods that would make modern conspiracy theorists seem like amateurs. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and desperation, if you enjoyed learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the secrets that shaped our past. The Renaissance wasn't just about beautiful art and scientific discovery. Behind the marble facades and painted ceilings, noble families were engaged in a ruthless game of bloodline politics, where a woman's virtue wasn't just her personal concern. It was a commodity that determined military alliances, trade agreements, and the rise and fall of entire city-states. A single scandal could unravel decades of careful diplomatic work and destroy fortunes that had taken generations to build. To understand why these women went to such extreme lengths, you need to understand what they were up against. In Renaissance society, a noblewoman's primary value lay in her ability to produce legitimate heirs and maintain her family's honor. Her body wasn't really her own. It was a vessel for continuing bloodlines, sealing political marriages, and preserving dynastic power. Any pregnancy outside of marriage wasn't just shameful, it was treasonous to the entire social order. The consequences of discovery were swift and merciless. A woman caught bearing an illegitimate child could be disowned by her family, stripped of her dowry, and banished from society forever. In some cases, she might be sent to a convent, where she would spend the rest of her life in silent penance. In the worst scenarios, she could face execution for adultery or for bringing dishonor to her noble house. The child, if it survived, would be branded a bastard and forever excluded from inheritance, titles, and social acceptance. But perhaps most terrifying was what happened to families when these scandals broke. Allied houses would withdraw their support, trade partnerships would collapse, and enemies would use the shame as justification for everything from lawsuits to military action. A single woman's pregnancy could literally start wars or end them, depending on the political climate and the enemies waiting to exploit any sign of weakness. This is why the women we're about to discuss didn't just try to hide their pregnancies. They developed methods so elaborate and so carefully orchestrated that they required months of planning, teams of conspirators, and enough money to buy the silence of everyone involved. These weren't desperate acts of shame. They were military-style operations designed to protect not just individual reputations, but entire political systems. The first method these women used was what historians call the traveling cure. When a noblewoman began showing signs of pregnancy, her family would suddenly announce that she was suffering from a mysterious illness that required treatment at a distant location. She might be sent to take the waters at a remote spa, visit a pilgrimage site known for miraculous healings, or stay with relatives in another country while supposedly recovering from a delicate feminine condition. These journeys weren't quick trips. They were carefully planned expeditions that could last 6 to 9 months, exactly long enough for a pregnancy to run its course. The woman would travel with a carefully selected entourage of servants, guards, and companions who were either completely loyal to the family or who had been paid enormous sums to ensure their silence. Often, these conspirators were bound by contracts that threatened terrible punishments if they ever revealed what they had witnessed. The destination was crucial to the success of the deception. It had to be far enough away that news wouldn't travel back to the family's home territory, but respectable enough that the woman's absence wouldn't raise suspicions. Remote monasteries were popular choices because they offered privacy and were known for discretion in dealing with noble families' sensitive matters. Mountain retreats, coastal villas, and foreign courts were also common destinations, each chosen for their ability to provide complete isolation from prying eyes. But the journey itself was only the beginning of the deception. Once the woman arrived at her destination, she essentially disappeared from public life. Her family would spread carefully crafted stories about her delicate health, her need for complete rest, and her doctor's orders that she receive no visitors until her mysterious condition improved. Letters would be sent back home describing her slow recovery, her gratitude for everyone's prayers, and her eagerness to return once her strength was fully restored. Meanwhile, in her place of exile, the woman was living through what might have been the most terrifying period of her life. She was cut off from everything familiar, surrounded by strangers who knew her shameful secret, and facing the physical and emotional challenges of pregnancy without the support system she had always depended on. Many of these women were still teenagers, barely out of childhood themselves, trying to navigate something they had never been prepared for. The actual birth was where the plan became truly dangerous. These women couldn't simply have their babies and return home. They needed to ensure that no evidence of the child's existence ever surfaced. This meant finding ways to dispose of newborns that wouldn't create witnesses or leave traces that could later be discovered. Some children were immediately given to peasant families who were paid to raise them as their own, with no knowledge of the child's true parentage. Others were handed over to religious orders that specialized in caring for abandoned infants, with generous donations ensuring that no questions would ever be asked about where the child came from. In the most heartbreaking cases, some women were forced to watch as their newborns were taken away immediately after birth, never to be seen again. They would never know if their children lived or died, whether they were raised with kindness or cruelty, or whether they would ever learn the truth about their noble heritage. For these mothers, the successful completion of their deception came at the cost of a lifetime of wondering and grieving for children they could never acknowledge. But even after the birth, the deception wasn't complete. The woman still had to recover from childbirth, regain her figure, and prepare for her eventual return to society. This process could take additional months, during which she would be treated by carefully selected physicians who specialized in helping noble women recover from what they euphemistically called difficult feminine conditions. These doctors were paid enormous fees for their services and their silence, and many built their entire careers on their reputation for discretion in handling delicate family matters. The physical recovery was just part of the challenge. These women also had to prepare psychologically for their return to normal life. They had to practice telling the story of their mysterious illness and miraculous recovery until it became second nature. They had to prepare for questions about their appearance, their health, and their experiences during their long absence. Most importantly, they had to learn to live with the knowledge of what they had done and ensure that no change in their behavior would ever hint at the secret they carried. When they finally returned home, these women were greeted as miraculous recoveries from death's door. Their families would celebrate their restored health, their friends would marvel at their renewed vitality, and society would welcome them back as examples of feminine virtue triumphing over mysterious afflictions. The elaborate deception would be complete, with everyone involved maintaining the fiction that nothing unusual had ever happened. But this method, sophisticated as it wasn't the only way noble women hid their pregnancies. Some developed even more elaborate schemes that involved staying at home while creating the illusion that they weren't pregnant at all. These women became masters of what we might call hiding in plain sight, maintaining their normal social schedules while using every trick available to conceal their changing bodies. The foundation of this approach was revolutionary fashion engineering that went far beyond simply wearing loose clothing. Noble families would employ the most skilled seamstresses and tailors to create special garments designed specifically to conceal pregnancy while maintaining the appearance of fashionable dress. These weren't simple loose gowns. They were sophisticated constructions that used hidden supports, strategic draping, and optical illusions to create the perfect silhouette. The process began as soon as a woman suspected she might be pregnant. Teams of seamstresses would be sworn to secrecy and begin creating a progressive series of garments that would evolve with the woman's changing body while maintaining a consistent outward appearance. These garments incorporated hidden panels that could be adjusted as needed, internal corsetry that redistributed the woman's silhouette, and layered construction that disguised any changes in her figure. But the clothing was just one element of a much more complex performance. These women had to master new ways of moving, sitting, and carrying themselves that would never hint at their condition. They learned to position their hands strategically to hide any telltale curves, to arrange their posture in ways that minimize their silhouette, and to time their appearances in public to coincide with the most flattering lighting and circumstances. The social aspect of this deception was perhaps even more challenging than the physical elements. These women had to maintain their normal schedules of social visits, court appearances, and family obligations while constantly monitoring every gesture and expression for anything that might betray their secret. They couldn't show signs of morning sickness, couldn't refuse wine or rich foods without raising suspicions, and couldn't display any of the mood changes or physical discomforts that often accompany pregnancy. Some developed elaborate systems of signals with their closest servants and family members, ways to communicate when they needed assistance, when they were feeling unwell, or when they needed to make quick exits from social situations. These conspirators became skilled at creating distractions, making excuses, and redirecting attention away from anything that might compromise the deception. The most dangerous moments came during the formal court events, where these women were expected to participate in elaborate ceremonies, dances, and rituals that could expose their condition. Court dances required specific movements and postures that could reveal a pregnancy to anyone who knew what to look for. The tight-fitting bodices worn during formal occasions left little room for concealment, and the physical demands of hours-long ceremonies tested even the most carefully planned disguises. Some women solved this problem by developing what their families called recurring ailments that would conveniently flare up during the most challenging social events. They might suddenly develop migraines that required them to retire early from balls, or stomach troubles that prevented them from participating in elaborate feast courses. These manufactured illnesses had to be believable enough to generate sympathy without being so serious that they attracted unwanted medical attention. The physicians who served noble families during this period were often complicit in these deceptions, though their involvement came at considerable risk to their own reputations and careers. These doctors would create false diagnoses that explained away the physical changes of pregnancy, describing mysterious feminine disorders that caused bloating, changes in appetite, and emotional fluctuations. They would prescribe treatments that seemed legitimate but were actually designed to help maintain the deception, such as special tonics that supposedly reduced swelling or dietary restrictions that conveniently excused changes in eating habits. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the hiding in plain sight method was how these women used the social expectations of their time to their advantage. Renaissance society expected noble women to be somewhat fragile and prone to mysterious ailments that were beyond the understanding of male physicians. This cultural assumption provided perfect cover for the physical and emotional changes that accompanied pregnancy. These women would begin complaining of vague symptoms months before their pregnancies became visible, describing feelings of weakness, digestive troubles, and nervous conditions that required special care and attention. By the time their bodies began changing in ways that might be noticeable, they had already established a narrative of illness that explained everything their observers might detect. The third method used by desperate noblewomen was perhaps the most disturbing of all. What historians have discovered through coded family letters and encrypted diary entries was called the replacement strategy. This involved not just hiding a pregnancy, but orchestrating an elaborate substitution that would allow a woman to maintain her position while secretly giving birth elsewhere. This method required the most extensive planning and the largest number of conspirators. It began with identifying another woman who could serve as a temporary replacement, usually a distant relative or a servant who bore enough physical resemblance to pass casual inspection. This substitute would be prepared for months in advance, learning the mannerisms, speech patterns, and personal habits of the woman she would impersonate. The logistics of this deception were staggering. The substitute had to be briefed on hundreds of personal details: the names and relationships of family members, intimate knowledge of household routines, awareness of ongoing political situations, and familiarity with personal correspondence and business matters. She had to master not just the woman's appearance, but her entire personality and social identity. Meanwhile, the pregnant woman would begin gradually reducing her public appearances, citing health concerns or family obligations that required her attention. She would make fewer social visits, delegate more responsibilities to trusted servants, and create reasons to spend increasing amounts of time in private quarters, where only her most loyal attendants could access her. The actual switch would happen during a carefully orchestrated event that provided cover for the exchange. A family funeral, a religious retreat, or a supposed medical emergency would create the chaos and confusion necessary for the substitution to take place undetected. The pregnant woman would disappear into a hidden wing of the family estate or a secret location, while her replacement would emerge to continue her public life. During the months that followed, the substitute would maintain the fiction of being the original woman while dealing with the constant terror of discovery. She had to remember not just facts and relationships, but also personal preferences, emotional reactions, and intimate details that only the real woman would know. A single mistake, forgetting a pet's name, reacting wrongly to a family joke, or failing to recognize an old friend, could expose the entire deception and doom everyone involved. The psychological pressure on these substitutes was immense. They were essentially living stolen lives, sleeping in beds that weren't theirs, wearing clothes that belonged to someone else, and maintaining relationships with people who would kill them if they discovered the truth. Many of these women were servants or distant relatives who had been coerced into participation through threats against their families or promises of rewards they might never live to collect. While the substitute maintained the public fiction, the real woman was living in complete isolation, often in hidden chambers within her own family's properties. These secret rooms were carefully constructed to be soundproof and invisible to casual observation, with hidden entrances disguised as bookcases, tapestries, or architectural features. The woman would remain in these chambers throughout her pregnancy and for months after giving birth, until her body had recovered enough to resume her normal appearance. The births that took place during these deceptions were attended only by the most trusted servants and physicians, people whose entire family's welfare depended on their absolute silence. These attendants knew that discovery would mean not just their own deaths, but the destruction of everyone they cared about. The pressure to maintain secrecy was so intense that some of these conspirators reportedly went mad from the stress of keeping such dangerous knowledge. The children born from these arrangements faced the same fate as those from the other methods: immediate separation from their mothers and placement with families who would never know their true origins. But in some cases, the elaborate nature of the replacement strategy allowed for even more creative solutions. Some children were secretly integrated into the households of the substitute women, raised as their own children with completely fabricated histories that would never connect them to their noble origins. The return of the original woman required yet another carefully orchestrated switch, timed to coincide with events that would explain any subtle changes in her appearance or behavior. She might return claiming to have experienced a spiritual awakening during her retreat, or describing how her mysterious illness had changed her perspective on life. These explanations provided cover for any differences that observant friends or family members might notice. But the psychological toll on these women was devastating. They returned to lives where they had to pretend that months of their existence had never happened, where they could never speak of experiences that had fundamentally changed them, and where they had to interact daily with people who had no idea what they had endured. Some never fully recovered from the trauma of the deception, developing what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders or dissociative conditions. The most tragic aspect of all these methods was how they isolated women from any possibility of emotional support during what should have been a profound and meaningful experience. Instead of celebrating the creation of new life, these women had to treat their pregnancies as shameful secrets. Instead of receiving care and comfort during childbirth, they had to endure labor in hidden rooms with only terrified conspirators for company. Instead of bonding with their newborns, they had to watch as their children were taken away to unknown fates. The long-term consequences of these deceptions extended far beyond the individual women involved. Families that had invested enormous resources in maintaining these elaborate fictions often found themselves financially weakened and politically vulnerable. The constant fear of discovery created atmospheres of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned relationships for generations. And the children who were born from these arrangements, scattered across Europe with false identities and fabricated histories, represented a hidden network of noble bloodlines that could never claim their rightful inheritance or position. Yet, despite the enormous costs and risks, these methods were remarkably successful. Historical records show that many of these deceptions were never discovered, even by modern historians who have access to private family archives and coded documents that reveal the truth centuries after the fact. The women who orchestrated these elaborate cover-ups demonstrated levels of strategic thinking, resource management, and psychological endurance that would be impressive in any context, let alone while dealing with the physical and emotional challenges of unwanted pregnancy. The success of these deceptions also reveals something disturbing about Renaissance society itself. How willing people were to participate in elaborate lies when it served their interests, how easily communities could be manipulated through carefully crafted narratives, and how completely individual human experiences could be erased when they conflicted with social expectations. But the story doesn't end with successful deceptions and hidden births. The most haunting aspect of these elaborate schemes was what happened to the women afterward, when they had to live for decades with the knowledge of what they had done and the children they had abandoned. The psychological aftermath of these deceptions would haunt noble families for generations, creating patterns of secrecy and emotional dysfunction that shaped European aristocracy in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The psychological devastation these women endured didn't end when their elaborate deceptions succeeded. In fact, for many, the real nightmare began after they had supposedly returned to normal life. They had to wake up every morning and pretend that nothing had changed, that they were the same people they had been before their secret ordeal. But inside, they were fundamentally altered by experiences they could never share with another living soul. Imagine trying to maintain casual conversations with friends who asked innocent questions about your health, your travels, or your time away. Every inquiry became a potential trap. A simple, "How are you feeling?" could send waves of panic through a woman who had spent months terrified that someone would notice her condition. "Did you enjoy your pilgrimage?" required carefully rehearsed responses that had to sound natural while concealing the truth of what had actually happened during those missing months. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their situation. These women were surrounded by people, family members, servants, friends, yet they could never truly connect with anyone again. They had crossed a line that separated them from the innocent world they had once inhabited. They knew secrets that would destroy lives, had participated in deceptions that required constant vigilance to maintain, and carried guilt that would follow them to their graves. Some women developed what their families attributed to lingering effects of their mysterious illnesses: sudden mood changes, periods of deep melancholy, and what court physicians called nervous conditions. In reality, these were likely symptoms of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress and complicated grief. They were mourning children they could never acknowledge, relationships they could never have, and parts of themselves that had been sacrificed to maintain their family's honor. The anniversaries were particularly brutal. Every year on the date their children had been born, these women would be expected to participate in normal family celebrations, social events, and religious observances, while privately remembering the most traumatic day of their lives. They might be laughing at a dinner party while internally calculating that their child was turning 2, 3, or 10 years old somewhere in the world, being raised by strangers who would never know the truth. Some women became obsessed with trying to discover what had happened to their children. They would make elaborate excuses to travel to regions where they suspected their babies might have been placed, hoping for glimpses of children who might bear their features. These desperate searches were incredibly dangerous. Any unusual interest in local families or persistent questions about orphaned children could raise suspicions that might unravel their carefully maintained deceptions. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discoveries came when these women occasionally did encounter their own children without being able to reveal their identity. Imagine seeing a young person at a market or religious festival and recognizing your own eyes, your own smile, knowing that this was the child you had carried and given birth to, but being unable to speak or acknowledge the connection. Some women reported experiencing physical pain during these encounters, their bodies recognizing what their social positions forbade them from claiming. The economic consequences of these elaborate deceptions often haunted families for decades. The enormous sums spent on bribes, travel expenses, construction of hidden chambers, specialized clothing, and payments to conspirators had to be hidden from family financial records. Creative accounting became necessary to explain missing funds, and some families found themselves financially weakened just when they needed resources most to maintain their political positions. Even more dangerous were the ongoing costs of maintaining silence. The servants, physicians, seamstresses, and other conspirators who had participated in these deceptions represented permanent security risks. They had to be kept comfortable enough that they wouldn't be tempted to sell their knowledge to enemies, but not so elevated that their sudden prosperity would attract attention. Many noble families found themselves essentially paying blackmail for decades, not because their former conspirators were actively threatening them, but because the mere existence of people who knew the truth required constant management. Some families developed elaborate systems for monitoring their former conspirators. They would place these people in positions where they could be watched, ensure their children received educations or marriages that bound them to the family's interests, and create webs of mutual dependence that made betrayal as dangerous for the servants as for their former employers. This created a hidden network of people throughout Renaissance society who shared dangerous knowledge but could never speak of it. The religious implications of these deceptions also created lasting psychological damage. Renaissance Christianity placed enormous emphasis on confession and spiritual purification, but these women could never fully confess their sins without destroying themselves and everyone around them. They attended Mass knowing they were living lies, received communion while harboring secrets that would scandalize their priests, and participated in religious festivals celebrating virtues they felt they had betrayed. Some women tried to find spiritual relief through anonymous confessions to priests in distant cities, carefully revealing their sins without providing details that could identify them. But even these attempts at absolution were complicated by the ongoing nature of their deceptions. They weren't confessing past sins that they could repent and move beyond. They were living lies that required daily maintenance and constant renewal. The impact on their marriages was often devastating, particularly for women who had been forced to hide pregnancies from their own husbands. These wives had to return to intimate relationships with men who had no idea what they had experienced. They had to accept their husband's affection while knowing they were deceiving the people closest to them. Some women became unable to be physically intimate with their spouses, developing what their families attributed to lingering health problems, but which was actually psychological trauma from their hidden experiences. Even more complicated were the cases where husbands had been complicit in the deceptions. These marriages became partnerships built on shared guilt and mutual vulnerability. The couples were bound together not by love or even political necessity, but by their knowledge that either could destroy the other. These relationships often became cold and transactional, with both partners maintaining the appearance of marital harmony, while living essentially separate emotional lives. The children these women later had in their legitimate marriages faced their own unique challenges. Their mothers, having been forced to abandon previous children, often became either overprotective or emotionally distant with their acknowledged offspring. Some women lavished excessive attention on their legitimate children, trying to compensate for the babies they had been forced to give up. Others found themselves unable to fully bond with any child, having learned to protect themselves emotionally from the pain of potential loss. These legitimate children often sensed that something was wrong without understanding what it was. They grew up in atmospheres of unexplained tension, surrounded by servants who seemed to share secret knowledge, in homes where certain topics could never be discussed and certain questions could never be asked. Many developed their own psychological problems as a result of this hidden family trauma. The political ramifications of these hidden pregnancies sometimes emerge decades later in unexpected ways. Children who had been secretly placed with peasant families occasionally displayed intelligence, ambition, or physical characteristics that attracted attention. A few even managed to achieve positions of influence without knowing their true origins, creating situations where noble families found themselves dealing with powerful individuals who were unknowingly their own abandoned offspring. Some of these hidden children developed obsessions with genealogy or heraldry, driven by subconscious desires to understand their true origins. They might become fascinated with particular noble families without understanding why or feel inexplicable connections to certain bloodlines. A few even managed to gain positions as servants or retainers in the households of their birth families, creating situations of incredible irony and potential danger. The most tragic cases involved hidden children who eventually discovered their true parentage through chance encounters, overheard conversations, or deathbed confessions from people who had participated in their abandonment. These discoveries often destroyed the lives they had built, leaving them unable to claim their rightful positions, but also unable to return to the identities they had known. They became living ghosts, existing between two worlds but belonging fully to neither. The methods these women used to cope with their trauma varied widely, but many developed elaborate systems of symbolic remembrance that allowed them to honor their lost children without revealing their secrets. They might commission religious artworks depicting the Holy Mother and Child, donate to orphanages or schools, or become patrons of institutions that cared for abandoned children. These acts of charity served as both penance and memorial, ways of channeling their grief into socially acceptable forms. Some women became obsessive record keepers, maintaining coded diaries or encrypted correspondence that documented their experiences in ways that could never be directly understood by outsiders. These hidden records have provided modern historians with some of their most valuable insights into the reality of Renaissance women's lives, but they also reveal the desperate need these women felt to have their experiences acknowledged, even if only by future generations who would never know their names. The impact on Renaissance society as a whole was more profound than most people realized at the time. The constant threat of scandal created atmospheres of suspicion and paranoia that affected everyone, not just those directly involved in deceptions. Families spent enormous resources on surveillance and counter-surveillance, trying to discover their enemies' secrets while protecting their own. This created a culture of espionage and blackmail that undermined trust and stability throughout the noble classes. The elaborate networks of silence that these deceptions required also created unexpected vulnerabilities for the families involved. The same discretion that protected them from scandal could be exploited by enemies who discovered ways to threaten their carefully maintained facades. A single person with knowledge of a family's secrets could destroy decades of careful reputation management, leading to a constant state of anxiety about exposure. But perhaps most significantly, these deceptions revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of Renaissance society's treatment of women. The same culture that celebrated feminine virtue and maternal devotion systematically forced women to abandon their children and deny their most basic human experiences. The idealization of motherhood coexisted with practices that made actual motherhood impossible for women whose circumstances didn't align with social expectations. The successful completion of these elaborate deceptions often marked the beginning of entirely new forms of psychological imprisonment for the women involved. They had saved their family's honor and preserved their social positions, but at the cost of becoming living lies. They spent the rest of their lives performing roles that required them to deny fundamental aspects of their own experiences and identities. Yet, despite the enormous personal cost, these women demonstrated remarkable courage, intelligence, and resilience in navigating impossible circumstances. They developed sophisticated strategies for survival that required not just careful planning, but extraordinary psychological strength. They managed to protect not only themselves, but often entire political networks that depended on their discretion and their ability to maintain elaborate fictions under the most intense pressure. The legacy of their sacrifices extended far beyond their individual lives, shaping the development of European aristocracy in ways that continue to influence family structures, inheritance patterns, and social expectations for centuries. Their hidden children, scattered across the continent with false identities, represented a shadow genealogy of noble bloodlines that occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways, creating ripple effects that historians are still discovering today. These women's stories remind us that behind every historical narrative of political achievement and cultural flowering, there are individual human experiences of profound sacrifice and loss that were deemed too dangerous or too shameful to acknowledge. Their elaborate deceptions succeeded not just because of careful planning and enormous resources, but because entire societies were willing to participate in collective denial when the truth became too inconvenient to acknowledge. The most haunting aspect of these stories is how completely these women's experiences were erased from historical memory, not just by their enemies, but by their own families who benefited from their sacrifices. Their successful deceptions became permanent silences, ensuring that their courage, their suffering, and their remarkable achievements in protecting the people they loved would never be properly recognized or honored. But now, centuries later, as historians decode their encrypted diaries and uncover their hidden correspondence, we can finally begin to understand the true cost of the elaborate facades that defined Renaissance noble society. These women paid prices that no one should have been asked to pay, yet they did so with a dignity and determination that continues to inspire, even as it horrifies us with its necessity. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that history's most celebrated periods often concealed unimaginable human suffering behind their golden facades. The Renaissance, for all its artistic brilliance and intellectual achievements, was built upon a foundation of systematic oppression that treated women's bodies as political commodities and their experiences as expendable necessities in the grand game of dynastic power. What makes these stories particularly chilling is how efficiently these systems of deception operated. How many people were willing to participate in elaborate lies when it served their interests, and how completely individual human experiences could be erased when they conflicted with social expectations. The success of these methods wasn't just due to careful planning or enormous resources. It revealed something deeply disturbing about Renaissance society's willingness to sacrifice anyone whose existence became inconvenient to the maintenance of power. The physicians who performed dangerous surgeries without proper anesthesia, the servants who carried lifelong secrets that could have destroyed them, the seamstresses who created elaborate disguises, the wet nurses who raised abandoned noble children as peasants. All of these people participated in a vast conspiracy of silence that stretched across Europe and lasted for centuries. They became unwilling guardians of secrets so dangerous that even speaking of them decades later could mean death. Perhaps most tragically, the very success of these deceptions ensured that the women who orchestrated them would never receive recognition for their remarkable achievements. They demonstrated levels of strategic thinking, resource management, and psychological endurance that would be impressive in any context. Yet their stories could never be told, their courage could never be acknowledged, and their sacrifices could never be properly honored. The children born from these arrangements faced equally tragic fates. Scattered across Europe with fabricated identities, they grew up never knowing their true heritage, never understanding why they felt different from their adopted families, never able to claim their rightful positions in society. Some spent their entire lives searching for connections they could never fully understand, driven by subconscious longings for families they had never known. Even more heartbreaking were the occasional moments when these hidden children encountered their birth mothers in public settings, at markets, religious festivals, or court gatherings, without either party being able to acknowledge the connection. These women had to watch their own flesh and blood grow up as strangers, had to suppress every maternal instinct when they recognized their own features reflected in young faces, had to maintain perfect composure while their hearts broke from the proximity of children they could never claim. The economic and political ramifications of these deceptions often outlasted the women who created them. Families found themselves financially weakened by the enormous costs of maintaining elaborate fictions, politically vulnerable due to the networks of people who shared their dangerous secrets, and socially isolated by their need to carefully manage every relationship to prevent exposure. The very success of their deceptions became a form of imprisonment that extended across generations. Some families never recovered from the strain of maintaining these elaborate lies. The constant fear of discovery created atmospheres of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned relationships for decades. Children grew up sensing hidden tensions they couldn't understand. Servants learned to navigate unspoken rules about topics that could never be discussed, and entire households developed complex systems of signals and codes to manage the ongoing deception. The religious implications haunted these women for the rest of their lives. In a deeply Catholic society that emphasized confession and spiritual purification, they carried sins they could never fully confess without destroying themselves and everyone around them. They attended Mass knowing they were living lies, received communion while harboring secrets that would scandalize their priests, and participated in religious celebrations while feeling fundamentally separated from the spiritual community they appeared to belong to. Many developed elaborate systems of symbolic penance, commissioning religious artworks, donating to orphanages, supporting institutions that cared for abandoned children, as ways of channeling their guilt into socially acceptable forms. These acts of charity served as both memorial and atonement, allowing them to honor the children they had lost while maintaining the fictions that had saved their families from ruin. The psychological toll was immense and lasting. These women often developed what their contemporaries attributed to lingering effects of mysterious illnesses, sudden mood changes, periods of deep melancholy, and nervous conditions that modern medicine would recognize as symptoms of trauma and complicated grief. They were mourning children they could never acknowledge, relationships they could never have, and parts of themselves that had been sacrificed to maintain their family's honor. The anniversaries were particularly brutal. Every year on the dates their children had been born, these women participated in normal family celebrations and social events, while privately remembering the most traumatic experiences of their lives. They calculated ages, wondered about personalities and achievements, and grieved for relationships that could never exist, all while maintaining perfect facades of contentment and virtue. Some became obsessed with trying to discover what had happened to their children, making elaborate excuses to travel to regions where they suspected their babies might have been placed. These desperate searches were incredibly dangerous. Any unusual interest in local families or persistent questions about orphaned children could raise suspicions that might unravel their carefully maintained deceptions. The irony of their situation was profound. These women had demonstrated remarkable courage, intelligence, and resourcefulness in protecting their families from scandal, yet they could never be acknowledged for their achievements. They had solved complex logistical problems, managed extensive networks of conspirators, and maintained elaborate performances under intense pressure, skills that would have made them formidable political leaders or military strategists if they had been born male. Instead, their success was measured by how completely they could erase their own experiences, how thoroughly they could deny the most fundamental aspects of their humanity, and how effectively they could transform themselves into living lies that served their families' political needs. The price of their families' continued prosperity was the systematic destruction of their own identities and the permanent separation from children who represented both their greatest shame and their most profound love. The hidden networks these deceptions created extended throughout Renaissance Europe, connecting noble families through shared secrets and mutual vulnerabilities. Former conspirators had to be monitored and managed for decades, creating ongoing security risks and financial obligations that affected family resources for generations. The servants, physicians, and craftsmen who had participated in these elaborate schemes became permanent potential threats, who required careful handling to ensure their continued silence. Some families developed sophisticated intelligence networks specifically to track their former conspirators and monitor potential security breaches. They placed people in positions where they could be watched, ensured their children received educations or marriages that bound them to the family's interests, and created webs of mutual dependence that made betrayal as dangerous for the servants as for their former employers. The most sophisticated families even developed contingency plans for managing exposure if their secrets were ever discovered. They prepared alternative narratives that might minimize damage, identified potential scapegoats who could be sacrificed to protect more important family members, and maintained resources that could be used for rapid relocation or political maneuvering if their carefully constructed facades collapsed. Yet, despite these elaborate precautions, the constant threat of discovery created a form of psychological terrorism that affected everyone involved. These families lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, where casual conversations could become potential traps. Innocent questions could trigger security concerns, and routine social interactions required careful monitoring for signs of suspicion or unusual interest. The children born into these families after the deceptions often sensed the underlying tensions without understanding their source. They grew up in atmospheres of unexplained anxiety, surrounded by servants who seemed to share secret knowledge, in homes where certain topics could never be discussed and certain questions could never be asked. Many developed their own psychological problems as a result of this hidden family trauma, creating patterns of dysfunction that extended across multiple generations. The cultural impact of these systematic deceptions was more profound than most contemporaries realized. The constant threat of scandal created a society where everyone was potentially compromised, where families spent enormous resources on surveillance and counter-surveillance, and where the maintenance of public facades became more important than addressing underlying problems or injustices. This culture of elaborate deception and mutual surveillance created unexpected vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. A single person with knowledge of a family's secrets could destroy decades of careful reputation management, leading to constant anxiety about exposure and enormous investments in maintaining networks of loyal conspirators. The successful noble families of the Renaissance weren't just those with the most military power or economic resources. They were those most skilled at managing information, controlling narratives, and maintaining elaborate fictions that protected their political positions. The women who orchestrated these pregnancy deceptions were pioneers in what we might now recognize as sophisticated public relations and crisis management. Though their achievements could never be acknowledged or celebrated, the methods they developed for hiding pregnancies required skills that would be valuable in any era: strategic planning, resource allocation, personnel management, risk assessment, and performance under pressure. They had to think several moves ahead, anticipate potential problems, develop contingency plans, and execute complex operations with precision timing and absolute discretion. Yet their remarkable abilities were channeled into efforts that ultimately reinforced the very systems that oppressed them. Their success in hiding pregnancies and maintaining family honor helped preserve social structures that treated women as property and denied them basic human rights. They became complicit in their own oppression, using their intelligence and courage to strengthen chains that bound not just themselves, but future generations of women. The tragic irony is that these women possessed exactly the qualities that Renaissance society claimed to value: intelligence, courage, loyalty, and dedication to family honor. Yet they were forced to use these virtues in service of deceptions that denied their fundamental humanity. They were simultaneously celebrated as paragons of noble virtue and systematically prevented from expressing their true capabilities or living authentic lives. Their stories remind us that behind every historical narrative of cultural achievement and political success, there are individual human experiences of profound sacrifice that were considered too dangerous or shameful to acknowledge. The Renaissance's artistic masterpieces and intellectual breakthroughs were created in a society that routinely destroyed women's lives to maintain political stability and social order. As we stand in museums today, admiring Renaissance paintings of noble families and their elaborate finery, we rarely consider the hidden stories behind those serene faces, the secrets that had to be maintained, the children who had to be abandoned, the women who had to live as lies to preserve the dynasties that commissioned those beautiful portraits. The encrypted diaries and coded correspondence these women left behind reveal not just individual stories of suffering, but systematic patterns of oppression that affected thousands of families across Europe. Their experiences weren't isolated tragedies. They were the predictable results of social systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of men while treating women's bodies and experiences as expendable resources in political games. Yet even as we recognize the horror of what these women endured, we must also acknowledge their remarkable resilience and the sophisticated strategies they developed for survival. They found ways to protect themselves and their families under impossible circumstances, demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of mortal danger, and maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to reduce them to political commodities. Their legacy extends far beyond their individual lives, influencing the development of European aristocracy, shaping inheritance patterns and family structures, and creating hidden genealogies that occasionally surfaced in unexpected ways centuries later. The children they were forced to abandon, scattered across Europe with false identities, represented shadow bloodlines that continued to affect political and social developments in ways that historians are still discovering. Most importantly, their stories serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of systems that prioritize political stability over individual rights, that treat people as means to achieve ends rather than as beings deserving of dignity and choice. The elaborate deceptions they orchestrated were symptoms of deeper social diseases that made such desperate measures necessary for survival. The women who hid pregnancies in the Renaissance paid prices that no human should ever be asked to pay. Yet they did so with a dignity and determination that continues to inspire even as it horrifies us with its necessity. Their courage in protecting their families came at the cost of sacrificing themselves, their relationships with their children, and their ability to live authentic lives. Their voices, silenced for centuries by the very success of their deceptions, finally echo across time through the hidden documents they left behind. Encrypted testimonies to experiences too dangerous to acknowledge, too important to forget, and too human to dismiss as mere historical curiosities. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their individual suffering, but the countless other women throughout history whose experiences were deemed too inconvenient for official records to preserve. The Renaissance may have ended centuries ago, but the forces that made these elaborate deceptions necessary, the treatment of women's bodies as political commodities, the prioritization of family honor over individual welfare, the systematic silencing of inconvenient truths, continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and hidden. These women's stories remind us that progress is never inevitable, that human dignity must be actively protected, and that the price of maintaining unjust systems is always paid by those with the least power to resist. In the end, their greatest achievement may not have been the successful completion of their elaborate deceptions, but their insistence on documenting their experiences for future generations to discover. Through their coded diaries and encrypted letters, they ensured that their voices would eventually be heard, their sacrifices acknowledged, and their stories remembered. Not as cautionary tales about the dangers of female sexuality, but as testimonies to human resilience in the face of systematic oppression and the terrible price of societies that deny women their fundamental humanity.